Welcome back, tech enthusiasts. Once again, you're tuning to Tech Talks Daily, the business technology podcast. We'll try and demystify every aspect of technology and the impact it's having on our business, our life, and even world. But if you've ever wondered about those sneaky vulnerabilities that are lurking behind your systems or the significance of cyber hygiene, today's episode is tailor-made for you because I'm absolutely thrilled to have Satnam Narang from Tenable, who's going to be joining us on the podcast today. If you live in the UK and you're outside the tech industry, Tenable is a quiz show. But of course, to anyone in tech or business, Tenable is an exposure management company that around 40,000 global organisations trust to understand and minimise their cyber risk. They're also the brilliant minds behind Nessus and have a legacy of ensuring digital safety. So today, I want to be delving deep into the known vulnerabilities, both here in the UK and in the global infrastructure, and understanding the thin line between a massive breach and your safety. But enough from me. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to the US, where today's guest is waiting to join us. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, hello, everyone. My name is Satnam Narang, or Narang, because sometimes we pronounce it that way. I'm a senior staff research engineer on Tenable's security response team. I've been working in cybersecurity for, I want to say, close to 17 years. And I've worked at small companies as well as large companies. And my most recent tenure at Tenable started back in 2018. I've done a lot of research around social media-based scams, but I've worked in web filtering, antivirus, vulnerability management. I've contributed to a group called the Anti-Phishing Working Group, developed a social networking guide with the National Cybersecurity Alliance, and a lot of my research has been covered in a number of publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC News, and others.
Wow, that's incredibly cool. And I suspect after 17 plus years in the industry, you've got more than a few grey hairs along the way and a few stories to tell. But for anyone listening, just to set the scene for our conversation today, can you provide the listeners with a brief overview of the recent findings related to known vulnerabilities in both the UK and global infrastructure, and also what makes these vulnerabilities particularly alarming? Because it's something we're hearing more and more about. And of course, technology has impacted every aspect of our lives, and we don't automatically think about the infrastructure that we all rely on and the vulnerabilities around that. So can you set the scene and expand on that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think probably one of the most noteworthy known vulnerabilities that we've seen being exploited recently, I would say, is this vulnerability in a piece of software called Move It Transfer. It's a secure file transfer application. It's used by a number of organizations, basically to securely share files. And what happened was a ransomware group discovered this vulnerability and they decided to exploit it. And what they found was they were able to exploit it so far in close to 700 organizations around the world. And they've stolen data of up to maybe 45 to 46 million. I guess I'm overestimating because I imagine that number will increase. I believe based on the data that we've seen so far, around 24 companies in the UK have been impacted by this attack. The attack has been conducted by a ransomware group known as CLOP. That's CLOP. Sometimes it's stylized CL0P. But basically, this is a ransomware group that's been around for several years now. They have a penchant for targeting file transfer solutions. This one would be considered their most successful. And they're still leaking data even as of today. There's new victims coming out. They're threatening to leak stolen data. So that one I think is probably the biggest one, Neil, so far. But then there's been other smaller vulnerabilities that have been exploited in the wild. Basically, we also hear a lot about older known vulnerabilities. I think there was a list that just got published in the last week or so by a bunch of government agencies, including the NCSC, CISA in the United States, NSA, ACSC in Australia. It was like a combined list of the most routinely exploited vulnerabilities. And it's not surprising to hear that I think well over 60% of those vulnerabilities were in software older than this year, like last year. So known vulnerabilities continue to be a problem for organizations. And we also see that bear out in a lot of the research that we do and a lot of the publications we put out each year. We put out an annual report called the Threat Landscape Report. So we talk a lot about that there as well.
Fantastic. And I'm glad you mentioned older vulnerabilities there, because before you came on the podcast, I was doing a little research, and it was both surprising and concerning in equal measure to hear that some of these vulnerabilities, such as those in Linux kernel, etc., date back to over a decade. So I've got to ask, why do you believe these decade-old vulnerabilities remain unaddressed and are only coming to light now? Because it seems quite shocking when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is that, oftentimes we don't know what we don't know, right? Oftentimes you have assets in your environment and they're just sitting there. They might be in a closet somewhere and just kind of collecting dust, but it's still hooked up to your network. It might be exposed publicly on the internet, which is often a big indicator of potential attack. Anything that's exposed to the internet, that has to be exposed to the internet. If you think about it, one thing that we learned through the start of the pandemic was as organizations shifted towards a remote workforce, you have to enable remote access to to your network. So they're standing up these virtual private networks, and these softwares are not up to date. And cybercriminals know that. They can look and probe for these softwares on the internet, and they can find holes in them. There's readily available exploit code. And essentially the problem is like I said, we don't know what we don't know. If you have assets that are online, that are accessible on the internet, and they're old, they haven't been touched in a while. We've seen a case where there was an organization in Japan that got hit by a ransomware group a couple of years ago. And the reason for this is that it was an old VPN that was still accessible. It was actually one that they were supposed to take down, but they never did. So it's an asset that they didn't know was still accessible online. So that's one of the reasons. And I think the other is just, sometimes organizations can't afford to take down specific assets. For example, email servers, right? We see a lot of vulnerabilities that are known in email servers like Microsoft Exchange Server being targeted by cyber criminals, because some organizations, they can't afford the downtime of taking down their email server because it's critical for them to have access to that email, and taking it down could present problems. Or it takes too long and that downtime is just too long for them and they can't do it. So some of the reasons why these older known vulnerabilities continue to be exploited by cyber criminals.
So when looking at this trend where cyber criminals are targeting known vulnerabilities, especially those with publicly available exploit code, can you expand on a little bit deeper on this trend and explain why this is such an attractive avenue for cyber criminals? Is it just cyber criminals? Is it state actors? Is it even bigger than that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you would think that, like state actors, nation state threat actors would be, focusing solely on zero-day vulnerabilities, but they're kind of observant of the trends, and they see all these, average cyber criminals, ransomware groups finding success targeting these known vulnerabilities. So in their minds, they're thinking, we don't have to spend the capital or the resources necessary to develop a zero-day vulnerability or go out and purchase a zero-day vulnerability. Why do we need to do that when all we simply need to do is go onto public source code repositories, search specific CVE identifiers, and look for publicly available exploit code? It's basically like, you're kind of walking into a store and, you see all these things that you want and you're like, okay, I'm just going to pick this one out. The difference is this store doesn't cost you any money. It's basically a free-for-all. Publicly available source code costs cyber criminals nothing. All they need to do is stand up some infrastructure potentially to help them automate their attacks if they're going to be, targeting a bunch of assets across the internet. But they make it relatively easy And I think that's really the most important part about it. What publicly available exploit code does is that it's typically used for defenders, right? The reason we see these publicly available exploit codes on the internet is that defenders are providing it, saying, hey, if you want to identify assets in your environment, but that same exploit code is used by these cybercriminals for malicious purposes. And it's a cost-saving measure, Neil, at the end of the day, right? If I don't need to figure out how to find a vulnerability in a piece of software and I can just grab something off the shelf, and I know that organizations are slow to patch vulnerabilities, it's like the perfect storm.
It really is. And I think for many business leaders, that log4 shell flaw and its exploitation by various actors has been a significant concern for some time now. And if we look around this area, is there anything you can break down around the challenges introduced by the increasing use of open source libraries and software, etc.? And also from there, what are the supply chain risks and how do they impact the broader cybersecurity ecosystem? And apologies for throwing about 3-4 questions at you there, but if you zoom out, it's all impacted together, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, we've kind of introduced Pandora's box in our software when we create software, because we're often relying on existing libraries to help us with certain tasks, right? So the log4j library was used for logging purposes, because when you create software, you have to log issues and you just want to keep track of what's happening with the software. Because as a developer, if there's a bug or something going on in your software, you need to know what's happening. Or if there's certain things you want to monitor around your software, you need to be able to log that information somewhere. And rather than writing your own logging library yourself, it makes sense, because it's like, okay, if the system isn't broke, why fix it, right? Why go out and manually spend the time to develop your own logging software when someone else has already spent the time, the resources, the capital to develop that software? This is the example for Log4Shell, but there are other libraries that we use in our software applications that we develop to help us, say connect to certain APIs, or, make requests to websites, or perform some additional functionality. So we're using and relying on these libraries. Oftentimes they're built into the software that we're using to develop the code in. Sometimes we have to go out and fetch these external libraries created by others. So the challenge here is that it can introduce additional risk, because you have all these organizations that are using the specific library, and for good reason, because it works, it's reliable. But if that code hasn't been audited and it's been around for years, it's possible, because we're not perfect, right? Human beings are not perfect. So when we develop code, chances are we're going to introduce bugs, right? So cyber criminals find these bugs, and because this software is so ubiquitous and it's used by a number of organizations, the irony in all of it, Neil, is that this was actually discovered through Minecraft. So people were playing Minecraft and using the chat functionality. Someone basically unknowingly discovered this vulnerability in Minecraft. And then from there, it just sort of spiraled out from there, because we started thinking, well, where else is this library used, right? So that's why you have certain initiatives like software bill of materials, or SBOMs, that are being pushed forward, because it'll help us identify what additional software is being used by these products that are being developed and shared on the internet, so we can keep track of which libraries are potentially vulnerable. You have, I think, some other initiatives like Google and Microsoft have partnered up to create like an open source initiative to try to help identify vulnerabilities in software that's open source. So this problem is not going away anytime soon. And I don't necessarily know if we're going to see another Log4Shell in the very near future, but I do think we still see supply chain type of attacks still happening. They're on a smaller scale. They're very basic. Like, for example, if you, let's say, import a library into some code that you're writing, if you don't install the right library, let's say you type in the wrong one when you're actually installing it on your machine, you could import an improper library that someone created to kind of like look like it. Like, let's say the library was Neil, right? Neil. But then I created a library called Neil, Neel, and you accidentally typed in Neel as the import. My library is what's going to get inherited in your software application. So then I could potentially steal information as you're writing your code or pushing it out. That's a kind of a crude example because I don't think anyone's going to find your name Neil and EL, but they could potentially do something along those lines, which is what we often see now in like the Python PyPy repository, as well as in NPM. We see a lot of typo squatting where they're kind of slightly changing the name of libraries and hoping that when people type them out, they'll mistype them.
Wow. And we will have people listening in over 160 different countries. And I suspect that everyone's got the same issue. And on behalf of everyone listening, let me say the elephant in the room is that many organizations, yes, they still have unpatched assets because BAU, delivering new projects or firefighting problems, that takes everyone's time and attention. So let's tackle this topic together today. What strategies or steps would you recommend that any business leaders listening should take to reduce their exposure and ensure that they aren't that low-hanging fruit for cyber criminals?
So the thing is that, this isn't like the end of the world. Organizations aren't helpless. I mean, we talk about like, cyber hygiene. Some of the most basic things that we can do for organizations is kind of follow the approach of like looking at business risk holistically, right? You might not be able to remediate everything at once because if you look at all the software in an environment, there's going to be a ton of software. It's about figuring out and prioritizing which one needs to be fixed sooner rather than later. And we do that by following certain metrics, looking at the severity of vulnerabilities, looking at the asset criticality. These are things we can do to kind of identify the potential exposure. Oftentimes a lot of the breaches that happen at organizations are the result of known vulnerabilities. So going through and having the ability to see into your network and look at all of the assets that are there, I think figuring that component out is one of the key elements in sort of lowering your cyber risk, because if we have visibility, that is like, one of the biggest steps an organization can take, because visibility is really one of the major elements of it. But it's not just vulnerabilities, right? There are malware, there's viruses, there's spear phishing, there's all these other avenues that cyber criminals can pursue to breach an organization. Social engineering works, and it's a tried and true technique that's been working for a really long time. So, I mean, taking into account cybersecurity awareness training, we kind of say like, cybersecurity awareness training is not also a panacea completely, but it is a step, right? It's like taking all these steps together, having good security software, endpoint security software, email security gateways, trying to basically guard your castle, so to speak. There are steps organizations can take, it's not just a one size fits all solution. There's a number of things that organizations can do. And it's a matter of taking all those steps. But it's not just about trying to defend against cyber attacks. It's also about being prepared to respond to a cyber attack. Because more often than not, it's not a question of if, but when a cyber attack is going to happen, because some determined actors will find a way. They're very crafty. They're very clever. So having like an incident response playbook in place for your organization to respond to an event. One of the things that I kind of recognized when it came to ransomware with one of my colleagues was we need to treat ransomware attacks like we treat natural disasters, because sometimes, you're not going to be able to prepare adequately for a disaster to stop it, right? Like a hurricane or an earthquake. It's also about how you respond in the face of a natural disaster. In the same way, how do you respond in the face of a ransomware attack? You don't want to be caught scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. Having the mechanism in place and not just being prepared for, but also like planning for it. Just as we, as a kid here in the US, we had earthquake drills, right? Where periodically we would have to get down underneath our desks and prepare for earthquakes. In a similar way, actually doing a tabletop exercise is essentially what we call it, where we actually go through a scenario where actual cyber attack has occurred, how we respond to it. We test our playbook to see if it's working, where the gaps are, and how we can fix that. So when an attack does occur, we are well equipped to respond.
And another topic that I wanted to highlight today was the rise in social media scams, not to mention crypto-related cyber attacks, which we're seeing all the time. So any insights you can share around what these type of attacks look like and how individuals and businesses and anybody listening can better protect themselves to avoid becoming a victim around it?
Yeah, so this is like my wheelhouse, Neil. I've been following social media scams for well over 12 years. I've been really focused on this area, and it's interesting to watch as new social media applications spring up. Scammers are not far behind, and new technology like cryptocurrency, as it's become more mainstream, it's become a very popular tool for cyber criminals. And it's also allowing cyber criminals to get away with a lot of their financial based schemes because they're able to transfer money through cryptocurrency, and there's a lot more difficulty in recovering those funds. So when it comes to social media scams, more often than not, what I'm personally seeing is a lot of like adult dating themed or like webcam based scams where basically you're being promoted to go click on a link to go to a website, and it's like enticing you to like talk to somebody. You think you're getting a follow from an attractive male or female, and you click on a link in their profile and it takes you to a website and they ask you to sign up. And just simply by you signing up, not putting any credit card information in, you're giving that cyber criminal money. It could be a small amount, $1 to $2. But then if you actually want to use the site more definitively and you want to communicate with people on the website, or you want to, have an account on there longer term that has access to like premium features, you give your credit card information. And as soon as you do that, that cyber criminal is going to make anywhere from $50 to $100 for that sign up. We call that a premium sign up. So affiliate programs, which is what drives a lot of these scams, are the big kahuna in the world of scams. And it is the biggest challenge that we have when it comes to scams, because these affiliate programs, they're not designed to be bad, but they're abused by scammers who are taking advantage of these websites. And it doesn't seem like those websites are doing much about it, because ultimately their goal is to drive traffic, increase accounts and subscribers and signups to their websites. So I think that's one of the main elements. We also have like fake products or questionable products that are being peddled online as well. I saw that really, really prominently at the start of the pandemic on TikTok and on Instagram. Started seeing people promoting like a lot of these products to combat the coronavirus, masks, sanitizer, things like that. They'll be promoted through shoddy mechanisms and means. So that's another area of concern. And then I think the other one too, which is getting the most traction now, Neil, is like romance scams, and specifically pig butchering, which is where scammers are basically taking users who are looking for relationships and taking them for a ride. It's a longer term, longer tail con where it's not just like, quick, let's try to get rich quickly. It's more of a longer play, right? They're slow rolling the victim. They're communicating with them often, trying to get their trust, and then convincing them to send tens of thousands of dollars, up to millions of dollars in cryptocurrency, and basically ruining people's lives. And it's probably the biggest issue, I would say, now in the world of scams.
Well, absolutely shocking. And cyber hygiene is often a term mentioned in cybersecurity circles to help to try and prevent things like that. And I suspect a lot of people listening will have a different idea of what that means. So can you just define what cyber hygiene means to you, and again, why it's essential for organizations to incorporate it into their cybersecurity strategies, because it's so important now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, Neil. And I mean, I think the term cyber hygiene is kind of designed to help evoke in the mind of the readers and the listeners. When we think of personal hygiene, what are the steps we take? We brush our teeth, we floss, we use mouthwash, wash our face, we shower. We take these steps to keep ourselves clean, right? In the same way that you take these multiple steps, similarly, when it comes to taking care of and being secure online, it requires you to take multiple steps, using strong and unique passwords, enabling two-factor authentication, finding these known vulnerabilities in your environment if you're an organization, having cybersecurity awareness training for your employees, using endpoint security software, as I talked about earlier, email gateways, having these things in place, right? These mechanisms, just as you would like part of your routine for personal hygiene. In the same way, we have these elements that come together to form cyber hygiene. So by taking these steps, we're putting ourselves in the best position to defend against and respond to cyber attacks. So, when we talk about it individual-wise, we're talking about, like I mentioned, passwords, two-factor authentication, because ultimately, a lot of times we see that being one of the key reasons why accounts get compromised. I just saw a story in the last day talking about how LinkedIn users are complaining about their accounts being hijacked. And, you would think, okay, is there a problem at LinkedIn? It doesn't appear to be that way. Based on what we've seen so far, it seems more likely that the LinkedIn accounts that are being compromised, it's happening due to the fact that LinkedIn users are reusing their passwords from other websites, and those other websites have had breaches. So that information gets taken and it's shared in cybercriminal communities. It's sold in these private forums. And once that information is out there, cybercriminals will take it and they'll start trying those combinations on websites like LinkedIn or other social media websites, and they'll get into these accounts and then they'll turn them into part of their scam routines, right? You'll see people that accounts change, their profiles change, information change. So that's part of the cyber hygiene, right? Having a strong and unique password, so that way, if your account is breached somewhere else, it's not going to come back to haunt you later because you happen to reuse the same password on your LinkedIn or your email, hopefully not on your banking account. And same thing goes for two-factor authentication. Let's say your password does get compromised and it is the same password on LinkedIn. If you have two-factor authentication in place, you're going to get a situation where the cybercriminal is going to have access to your device. And they're unlikely to have access to your device, so they're not going to be able to get into your account. So these are steps that we can take to improve our cyber hygiene to prevent an attack from being successful. And, we've kind of talked to death about the known vulnerabilities. Finding those assets and environments are a critical component to cyber hygiene.
Fantastic advice. And of course, with the constant evolution of this cybersecurity landscape, though, a question I've got to ask is, how do you at Tenable stay ahead of the curve, and any advice you can offer to organizations looking to move away from that reactive approach to cybersecurity to a more proactively approach to address potential threats in the coming years? Any advice you can offer there, and how you guys do it as well? Because I suspect there'll be a lot of people listening looking up to Tenable and on how you stay up to speed.
So from a personal perspective, the way I stay up to date on everything is I don't sleep. So I'm basically just plugged in most of the time. No, but to be honest with you, the way we stay up to date is we are, my team in particular, security response, our job is to keep our ear to the street. We are constantly following what's happening with trends in cybersecurity and in the threat landscape. It's a crucial part of it. And, our Tenable research organization has a number of individuals around the world that are dedicated to keeping up to date, having this knowledge of what's happening in the threat landscape. So it is our duty to stay up to date. And then we take our learnings and we apply them to our products, whether it's through the plugins we release, and, the blogs we put out. It's part of our job duty. And so we have a lot of people on the team with a broad depth of knowledge and skill set. So we're very lucky that we have, a diverse group of individuals with a number of skills that we can bring to the table, and that we are in service ultimately of our customers and keeping our customers safe, and also in educating the general public about what's happening in the threat landscape.
I think that's a great moment to end on. But we have covered a very serious and critically important topic today, and everything around cybersecurity. But it's my responsibility to ensure everyone leaves us listening on a high today, and I'm going to bring you into this. So we have a Spotify playlist where I always ask my guests to add a track to this playlist that's important to them, inspires them, or maybe something they've just heard recently and they enjoy. But all I'm going to ask is, what would you like to leave to our Spotify playlist, and why?
So I think this is my favorite question in the entire interview, to be honest. Not that I didn't enjoy all the questions, but I love music. Music is one of my favorite things on this planet. I think there's a quote from Nietzsche, and forgive me if I'm butchering his name, but he said, "Without music, life would be a mistake." So I really ascribe to that. I really struggled with picking a single song because I could give you so many, Neil. And I looked through your playlist too, and I was like trying to figure out what I could add to the playlist that would be a little different. Like, is there enough metal? Is there enough hip hop? I was really trying to figure that out. And honestly, I could not pick just one song. So my gut is leaning me towards sharing one of my favorite bands. Some people will know them, but some people may have never heard of them. They're a band called Glassjaw. And they've been around for a long time. And one of my favorite songs by them is from an album of theirs called Worship and Tribute, which is a phenomenal record. It's their most popular song, but I think your listeners will enjoy it. It's called Ape Dos Mil, APEDOSMIL. It's a beautiful song.
Fantastic choice. Can't beat a bit of post-punk to get on the Spotify playlist. And because you're a music guy, I'm going to do something I don't usually do here. I'm going to let you have a second entry as well. So if there's one other song that maybe was getting very close to being added, what would that be?
Oh, gosh. Can I throw a curveball at you?
Yeah, man.
Yeah? Okay. So for your listeners, I'm actually a former rapper myself. I actually put out an album about over a decade ago. So this is really random, but I would love to potentially have one of my songs on your list. That would be cool.
Yeah, go for it.
It's a song called Wishing Doll. It's from my EP called Heart of a Lion.
Awesome. I'm going to get that added as well. Well, if you told me this at the beginning, I would have had you spitting bars at the very beginning. So you've got away lightly today. But for anyone listening who wants to find out more information about anything we've talked about today, where would you like to point everyone listening?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple resources I would say. So first and foremost, we have a dedicated page on the Tenable website for research. It's tenable.com/research. We also publish a lot of our content that when we find new vulnerabilities and new threats, we publish them on the blog, tenable.com/blog. And you can find me on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now at my handle is just my first name, Satnam.
Perfect. I'll get those links added so people can find you nice and easily. And just love chatting with you today about, yes, known vulnerabilities in global infrastructure, the lurking decade-old bugs and vulnerabilities that could be the difference between a multi-million-pound breach and safety. Not to mention all things cyber hygiene, social media scams. And on top of that, you even had a chance to leave us with a great track and even one of your own songs. I think in 2,500 interviews, you're the first person to add or be able to add a song that you've played yourself. So I'll be getting both of those added. But thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you today, and thanks for sharing your story.
Thanks for having me, Neil. I appreciate it.
So a massive thank you to today's guest for shedding some light on some of the most pressing issues in the cyber world today, from those decade-old vulnerabilities that we're still talking about to the importance of cyber hygiene. For me, today's episode was a treasure trove of information, and I want to remind everyone listening to remain cautious, especially in the realms of social media scams and crypto attacks. And speaking of reminders, don't forget to check out our Spotify playlist, where Satnam has had a fantastic track. I'm even going to add his song that he's recorded himself. You'll hear a different side to him, so check that out too. And if you want to connect with me, if you want to work with me, if you want help with business blogs, thought leadership blogs, or help launching your own podcast, whatever it might be, email me now, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, just at Neil C. Hughes. Nice and easy to find. But that's it for today. So thanks for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.